Chapter 25 of A Daily Rate by Grace Livingston Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25. Celia aroused herself from her unhappiness in time to hurry to her Sunday school class. She purposely went late that she might not be obliged to walk with anyone, and she intended to hurry home before any of the others from her house had left the chapel. But it so happened that one of her scholars had a sad tale to tell her of trouble and need, and she was obliged to linger and get the particulars. There was an address to be taken down, and several items of information she would need in helping him to find work. When this was done, and she glanced hurriedly around to see if the others were gone, she saw that one of her boys was lingering with an embarrassed expression, half smiling, half doubtful, as though he might wish to speak a word with her. Something told her that this heart was ready for a quiet, personal word, and here was the time. The other boarders were gone. The minister with hat in hand was standing by the front door talking with a man. He was evidently about to go also. There were one or two groups in earnest conversation, a teacher with two of her class, 3 women in a corner, and a young man and a young girl talking. "Ben," she said, "can you sit down and talk with me a few minutes?" The hunger for souls was awakened within the young teacher. Her own heart's unrest and sadness made her long to plunge into some other interest. She put her whole soul into the words she spoke, and the young man listened intently. There was no doubt but that she had reached his heart, and that he was on the point of yielding to the Holy Spirit. Celia prayed as she talked, and forgot herself, forgot everything but her desire for this soul's salvation. She listened to his hesitating, low words in answer to her earnestly put questions with bated breath. She could almost hear her own heart beat while she waited for his final decision, as he sat minute after minute thoughtfully looking down at the toe of his rough, unblackened shoe, and trying to fit it between 2 nails in the floor, where the boards were somewhat torn away by the many feet that trampled over them. The decision was made at last, and the boy, with a furtive glance around him, drew his coat sleeve hurriedly across his eyes as he strode out of the room, after having murmured an incoherent good-bye. Celia stooped to pick up her rubbers, which lay under the seat, and then looked about the deserted room. The sexton was doing something to a refractory window, which refused to go up and down right. He was used to busying himself while lingerers kept the church open. Celia thought everybody else was gone, till, as she neared the door, the minister arose from one of the back seats and came toward her. "Would you mind sitting down a few minutes longer?" he said. "I want to tell you something, and it seems to me that I can tell it better here than anywhere else." Celia felt her heart throbbing and her knees suddenly grow weak, so that she sat down more because she felt she could not stand without tottering than because Mr. Stafford had asked her to do so. The day had been an exciting one for her, and her emotions had been stirred to their depths by the wonderful talk she had just had with the boy, Ben. What could be coming now? She could not understand, and yet she felt in some way that it would have to do with the things which had been hurting her so all day, and would probably hurt her more. She passed her hand across her forehead wearily, and tried to brace herself to bear whatever might be said. Perhaps he would ask for sympathy in his sorrow, and how could she give it? She sent up a swift prayer for help. Mr. Stafford must have seen the weary expression and the piteous baffled look in her face, for a troubled one came over his own, as he took his seat in a chair near her, and asked anxiously, "Are you too tired just now? Perhaps I ought to wait. I know you have been working hard, and your work is telling, too. I could see by that boy's face as he went out that he will be a different fellow from this time forth. Now, if you would rather go right home, please say so." But there was a note in his voice of longing to be heard now that made Celia push aside her desire to slip out of it on the plea of weariness, and assert, a little coolly perhaps, that she could hear him now just as well as to wait. Her manner made his heart sink, but he began what he had to say with a frank, "Well then, I'll try not to keep you long. Miss Celia," it was the first time he had ever called her that, though several of the other boarders had adopted it from hearing Molly Poppleton address her in that way, "I do not know whether or not you know that I have been passing through deep waters during the past week. I have been by the deathbed and then by the grave of one who was very dear to me. I felt as though I wanted to tell you about her, not only because I need the sympathy which I know you can give, but because she knew all about you and your work, and was deeply interested in you." If Mr. Stafford had not been looking down and struggling to control his voice so that it would be steady and without the deep emotion he felt, he would have noticed that Celia's face grew swiftly white. It was worse then than she had feared. Not only was she asked to give sympathy, but this other woman had known all about her. They had talked her over together. Why this should seem so dreadful to the girl she could not quite understand, but at the time it seemed more than she could bear. It was well Mr. Stafford did not pause for a reply, for Celia would have been incapable of giving any just then. "She had been ill for a long time," he went on, his voice breaking a little. "We knew she could not stay with us much longer, and yet you will understand that it was hard to part with her." He told in a few words of her beautiful life of sweet patience and cheerfulness in the face of pain that had endured for years, till Celia felt ashamed of her selfish jealousy, and longed to shut herself away from sight that she might cry in quiet. The great tears filled her eyes and fell unheeded on her hands. She felt herself the meanest and smallest of mortals, and this other one beautiful and good and bright enough to be, as she was, with the angels. And yet her heart was very miserable. She longed to speak a word of sympathy, but she knew that she could not, and blamed herself for it. "I want to show you her face," he said, putting his hand in his breast pocket and bringing out a little velvet case, which Celia knew even through her blinding tears. He opened and placed it in her hands, the lovely face with its velvet blue eyes looking into hers, as he said, "She was my only sister, you know, and she was so good to me." Then the strong man bowed his head on his hand and covered his eyes. He did not see Celia start as he said this, but he heard the difference in her startled exclamation, "Your sister? Why, I thought—" and then she stopped, and when he looked up, as he did at once, her face had changed from white to rosy red. He looked at her face, lovely behind its tears and blushes, and read the dawning sympathy, and was glad even in his sorrow. "You thought what, may I know?" "Why, said Celia, embarrassed and hesitating, blushing deeply, I did not know you had only one sister," she finished desperately. "But what was it you thought? May I not know?" he asked again, with a searching look at her face. "No," said Celia, dropping her eyes to the picture and trying to hide her embarrassment by wiping away the tears with her handkerchief. "Then may I tell you, and you will say whether I am right?" asked the minister, a daring light coming into his eyes. "You thought that she was someone even nearer and dearer than a sister?" He looked at her long and earnestly, and seemed to be satisfied with the answer of her mute, drooped face. "Oh, Celia, did you not know that you were the only one who ever had or would occupy that place in my heart? Have you not seen that I love you? Don't you know it? And don't you care just a little, Celia?" The front chapel door stood open, and the afternoon spring sunshine was flickering fitfully across the floor. They could see the people on the street passing, loitering and talking, some looking curiously in as they passed, but none seeming to notice them. Celia felt it all as she sat dumb in the midst of a whirl of joy and sorrow and shame, and she knew not what else. She could not answer. She could not look up. The minister's eyes were upon her, and she felt what the look in them would be, and knew she could not bear the joy of seeing it. The silence was long and could fairly be heard. The sexton, who was growing hungry, came back from the little alcove where the primary class was held, and where he had been straightening the chairs for the evening service and distributing hymn books. He drew quite near to them now, and slammed books and put down windows significantly. Celia, feeling that she must say something, murmured low, still with downcast eyes, "How should I know it?" The minister laughed and then grew grave. "That is true," he said. "I never could tell you, because you would not let me. But she knew it, and she was glad of it, and loved you, and left her blessing for you." Then he turned suddenly to the sexton, a new tone in his voice. There was something about Celia that no longer discouraged him. "Thomas," he said, "I am going now. Will you kindly see if I left my Bible in the primary room?" Thomas went with alacrity to search the primary room. The minister watched the sexton until he had disappeared, and then he stooped swiftly and picked up Celia's gloves, which had fallen unheeded to the floor. As he handed them to her, he reverently touched his lips to one of her little, cold, ungloved hands. She lifted her face for a moment, and in that moment he got his answer from her eyes. The sexton was coming back without the Bible, which the minister suddenly discovered to have been lying on the floor under his chair all the time, and the two stood decorously apart, Celia trying to keep her cheeks from growing redder, as she walked to the open door and looked out into the glad spring sunshine, gladder than any sunshine her eyes had ever looked upon before. Some little child, perhaps, had dropped a flower upon the steps, and as she stood waiting for the minister, she saw it. It was then she remembered the rose on her lunch tray and its sweet message of hope. God's plans for thee are graciously unfolding, and leaf by leaf they blossom perfectly. Her heart thrilled over the joy that this had come true, while she realized that her happiness was yet only in the bud, and she could see the promise of the day-by-day opening of it for her. Oh, why had she been doubting? Why could she not trust him perfectly? She lifted her heart in one swift breath of penitence and thanksgiving. She felt in that first gush of joy that she would never doubt her Lord again. Then she turned to walk down the glorified street and gaze on the familiar surroundings under a halo of joy. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of A Daily Rate by Grace Livingston Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 26. It was noon and it was June, and there was to be a wedding in Mrs. Morris's boarding house that was. It was not the wedding, that is, the wedding nearest and dearest to Aunt Hannah's heart. That was to be later and in the new chapel, and about it most of the boarders had not even heard as yet. Later, when they knew, the bridegroom of the first wedding said it was a pity they had not fixed things up sooner so that they could have had a double wedding. That would have been real nice. And Celia and Horace Stafford had looked meaningly at one another and never hinted that such an arrangement would have been other than entirely satisfactory to them, provided things had been fixed up in time. They had their little quiet laugh over it, of course, and kept their secret. Meantime, the present wedding was a source of deep interest to every member of the household. Each one contributed something to the general plans. The parlor, that used to be so dismal, was itself in bridal array. The organ at the further end was literally smothered in palms. The palms and flowers were Mr. Roger Houston's contribution. He was not a boarder, but he had become a frequent visitor at the house, and seemed to be as much interested as any in the event. But the arrangement of the palms was Celia's, and Celia was to sit behind them and play the wedding march in the softest, sweetest tones she could coax from the old organ. They made a lovely background for the bride and groom, and they completely hid the organ and the player. Under the mantelpiece, and above it, where used to hang the crayoned visage of the deceased Mr. Morris, were more palms, and the imitation marble mantelpiece, which Celia always said looked as mottled as though it were made of slices of bologna sausage, was covered with a bank of lovely roses, white and pink and yellow and crimson. If the wedding had been Celia's, she would have preferred to have the roses all white, but the bride in this case was extravagantly fond of color, and had declared herself in favor of "lots of roses, all colors," so longingly that Roger Houston said, "Let's please her for once if she wants green roses, even if the white would be better taste, Miss Murray. It's her first wedding, you know, and after all, a rose is a rose." But the colors were arranged with Celia's own skill, and no two colors dared but harmonize. Out in the dining room, the long white table was dressed in trailing vines of smilax and roses, and the largest and most orthodox wedding cake that could be procured occupied the place of honor. All about it were evidences of Molly Poppleton's art, and everything spoke of readiness for the ceremony to begin. Up in her room, the bride was being arrayed. The dress was a simple white muslin, plainly made, but she was to wear a veil. It would perhaps have been more sensible to have worn a traveling dress, as she was to go away at once, but Mamie, for of course you know the bride was Mamie Williams and the groom Bob Yates, had always cried and said she couldn't feel that she was really married if she didn't wear white, when Miss Grant counseled economy and good sense. Seeing her heart so set, they did not try to persuade her, but managed to change her purpose of purchasing a flimsy white silk, which would never be of any use to her afterward, and persuaded her to take instead this simple white lawn. She had demurred, but finally consented. She was never wholly reconciled to the change, however, but was somewhat consoled by the fact that it was white, and she was to have a veil. Celia herself dressed her hair and arranged the soft folds of the veil, and kissed her, and told Aunt Hannah afterward that Mamie Williams was really lovely in her pretty array. Miss Hannah thought so too, as she came up to give the girl a few last words, as her mother might have done perhaps had she been there. She found Mamie standing by her bureau with her open Bible before her. Miss Grant did not know that the white vision of herself in the glass had prompted her to turn to that first Bible verse of hers and read it over again. And to her was granted that she should be arrayed in fine linen, clean and white, for the fine linen is the righteousness of the saints. Nor could she know that the softened, glorified look on her face came from the thought in her heart that now, perhaps, even she might one day wear that pure heavenly dress of clean white linen, the garment of Christ's own righteousness. Bob Yates had saved up a nice little sum, and now there was waiting for them, not many blocks away, a new, neat house of 4 or 5 rooms, as daintily furnished as a bird's nest. There Mamie was to put in practice the culinary arts she had learned from Miss Grant and Molly Poppleton, and to entertain her friends and some of the young girls with whom she had grown intimate during her time of selling ribbons with Dobson and Co., for she had attained to that and taken Celia's place, and now in turn was to give it up to a young girl from the minister's Sunday school class. And they were to have a real wedding trip too, like all the girls in the stories Mamie had read in the days when she used to fancy Mr. Harold Adams held the key for her of all such delights. They were going to Atlantic City, to a hotel, for a whole delightful week. And then they were going to see Mamie's mother, and all her little brothers and sisters, and her gruff, hard-working father. After that, Bob Yates would take his bride to visit his married brother and sister out in Indiana, the Far West, Mamie called it, and then they would come back to their little house, and their new furniture, and their dear church, and their respective Sunday school classes. It was all very beautiful, and Mamie felt very happy, and all the boarders felt happy for her. She went back in memory to the time when Mrs. Morris was there, and felt, rather than thought, how different her life was now, and in fact how different everything was, and thanked God for the change. She thought of Carrie Simmons with a pang, and wished that she could have done something for her. Perhaps, if Miss Grant had come sooner, Carrie might have been saved. Mamie had so far forgotten her old pride that she actually felt a little glad that Carrie could not look in from all her own sorrow and misfortune and shame and misery, in which she had heard she dwelt, and see her own joy and happy surroundings. Miss Grant had gone down to the kitchen to watch things while Molly Poppleton got on her best gown for the ceremony, and everything was progressing toward the last exciting minute, when the doorbell rang. The second girl, who was setting chairs in the dining room in the best possible way to economize room, went quietly to the door, her neat blue and white striped gingham and white waitress apron and cap making a decided contrast to the slatternly Maggie who used to answer the door in Mrs. Morris's time. The large, oldish-looking woman and the tall, grizzled man, unmistakably a farmer, who stood together on the step, stared at the girl when the door was opened, in undisguised amazement. "Why," said the woman at last, looking up at the number over the door as if mistaken in her whereabouts, "isn't this a boarding house?" "Yes, it is," responded the maid. "Won't you walk in? Miss Grant is busy just now. That is, she will be in a minute, but I guess she can see you first. Did you want to get bored?" She had ushered them into the bedecked parlor, which happened at the moment to be entirely uninhabited, as the boarders were all in their rooms, donning their gala attire. But she saw that they had evidently not heard her question, so telling them to be seated, she went for Miss Grant. The strangers, however, did not sit down. Instead, they stood staring around. "For the land's sake!" ejaculated the woman at last, looking around her more and more bewildered. "Well, it's pretty nice, 'pon honor, Maria. I wonder how you ever gave it up for an old fellow like me." And he looked at her quizzically. But the look was lost this time. She was taking in the familiar pattern of the carpet, which somehow looked strangely bright, and noting all things new and old about the room. Then came Miss Grant with her soft gray cashmere, made more lovely by the cloud of white tulle she wore about her neck, which seemed to blend so tenderly with the creamy white of her hair. She stood a moment looking doubtfully at the visitors, seeing something familiar about the woman's face, but for an instant not recognizing her. "Miss Grant, don't you know me? I'm Mrs. Morris. Leastways, that used to be me name. I'm Mrs. Sparks now. I married out there in Ohio, and I'm real comfortably fixed. He," nodding her head toward the man, "has a farm and a nice house, and owns several houses in the town besides. But I couldn't rest comfortably no ways a thinking of you and the hole I left you in, and at last me husband found out just what was the matter, and he just brought me on to see how you was gettin' along, and to say he'd help you out of it if you got badly stuck and pay some of the bills I left behind me. But when we got here, everything looked so kind of different, somehow I couldn't think 'twas me own house. You don't look as if you was hard up. What's the meanin' of it all anyway? And what's goin' on? Are you expectin' company?" Miss Grant's face shone with welcome, and her greeting was cordial, even in the midst of this busy time. "We're going to have a wedding in half an hour," she said, "and you're just in time. They will both be delighted to have you here, for they are two of your old boarders. And you can relieve your mind about me, for I'm not in any hole at all, and coming here was the best thing that ever happened to me in some ways. I'm grateful to you for giving me a full-fledged boarding house. I find every month that I am getting on a little more financially. It isn't great riches, but it is sure." "A wedding! For the land's sake!" said Mrs. Morris Sparks sententiously. After Miss Grant had excused herself in haste to answer a call from Molly, the guest called after her. "It must be that nice niece of yours, Miss Murray, but I didn't never think she'd take Bob Yates, she used to be so awful stiff with him, but land alive, you never can tell." Miss Grant smiled to herself as she hurried down the hall. She would not explain now, as the visitor would soon see for herself. That evening, after all the guests were gone and the bridal pair had departed, Miss Grant took Mrs. Morris Sparks, and slipping out the front door, let her in by a latchkey to the adjoining house which had for months been closed, with a for rent sign in the window. This, however, had disappeared. She carefully locked the door behind her, and turning up the gas, pointed out the place where wide double doors had been roughly drafted on the wall between the two houses. She also enlarged upon some other improvements, among them a wide bay window to be added in both first and second stories of the front of the house. Then she took her upstairs, and showed a suite of rooms beautifully furnished, and told the story of how the minister had bought this house and furnished these rooms for himself and Celia, and that the houses were to be connected, and the remainder of the room used to enlarge the boarding house, in which scheme their hearts were deeply interested. She told her, too, how with careful looking to the little details she had been enabled not only to make both ends meet, but to have a trifle over, and how she hoped in the coming year, with the enlargements and her present experience, actually to make it a paying business. And Mrs. Morris Sparks looked and listened, and shook her head, but all she could say was, "For the land's sake, who'd a thought of it?" End of chapter 26. Chapter 27, the final chapter of A Daily Rate by Grace Livingston Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 27. Hiram and Nettie Bartlett had been talking a good deal lately about running down to Philadelphia to see Aunt Hannah and Celia. Hiram was feeling that a little ready money in his business would enable him to get through a hard time which he saw ahead. Nettie was missing Aunt Hannah dreadfully, as the hot days grew longer. They had decided that it would be a good thing to forget and forgive, and open their home, and as much of their hearts as was necessary, to their relatives. Aunt Hannah would manage the kitchen, and Celia would manage the children, and Hiram would manage Celia's money. Having decided matters thus, and made some changes in the arrangements of the rooms to suit the new order of things, they began to feel very sure that it was to be. Of course, Aunt Hannah and Celia were thoroughly tired of living in a boarding house by this time, and would welcome the change, and they had but to speak the word, and they would fly back to Cloverdale. But before they came, it would be a pleasant change to take the children to Philadelphia for a visit. No sooner had they decided this than Nettie wrote to Aunt Hannah. The letter reached Philadelphia in the midst of plans for Celia's wedding. They read it together, Celia and Aunt Hannah, and looked at one another in dismay. Somehow, in the joy of the life they were living, they had forgotten to write Nettie anything about Celia's proposed marriage. Perhaps it was but natural, as Nettie very seldom answered Aunt Hannah's long letters, which had been written at regular intervals at first, until she began to feel that they were not desired. But now they both felt that Nettie must be invited. Celia summoned all the cousinly feeling she had ever possessed for Nettie, and wrote her a nice letter, putting into it a little touch of her sweet, girlish joy over the happiness that had come to her. She finished with a cordial invitation to them all to come on, though the addition to the family at this time would be extremely inconvenient. Celia did fret a little over their coming. Hiram would be disagreeable, and Nettie would want to manage everything, and the children would be always about when they were not wanted. She was sitting one evening thinking about it, with brow knit in troubled thought, when Mr. Stafford came in. He watched her a moment, and then taking both his hands, he placed them over her ruffled brow and smoothed the wrinkles out. Then he bent and kissed her forehead fondly. "What is the matter, dearest?" he said. "I mean to make it my business always to keep that troubled look away from your dear face." "Oh, Horace, how can I help it? I have tried and tried, but I do not seem to be able to conquer the habit. Indeed, I am ashamed of it. Can you not tell me how I can conquer it?" "Only by casting all your care upon him who careth for you. Listen, Celia, have you ever heard this? Wherefore should we do ourselves this wrong, or others, that we are not always strong? That we are ever overborne with care, that we should ever weak or heartless be, anxious or troubled, when with us is prayer, and joy and strength and courage are with thee." Then Celia opened her heart to him and told him the story of her winter, beginning with her birthday and the little bookmark Aunt Hannah had sent. "And I thought then, Horace," she went on, "after that money came to me, my daily rate, for all the days of my life, that I would never doubt any more, because I had money, and with that I could be able to relieve most of the other anxieties. But I found it wasn't so. I began to fret about other things, and then after I got money, I wanted love, and now I have that, I find I'm still fretting." "It's because you don't remember that it's for every day, dear, and that means for every need of every day. You trust for one set of things, but you think you have to worry along and look out for another set. Here is a quaint old poem I came across the other day that I cut out and put in my pocketbook to read to you sometime. It fits in right here. Let me read it. "I have a never-failing bank, my more than golden store. No earthly bank is half so rich. How then can I be poor? 'Tis when my stock is spent and gone, and I not worth a groat, I'm glad to hasten to my bank and beg a little note. Sometimes my banker smiling says, 'Why don't you oftener come?' And when you draw a little note, why not a larger sum? Why live so niggardly and poor? My bank contains a plenty. Why come and take a £1 note when you can have a 20? Nay, 20,000, 10 times told, is but a trifling sum to what my Father has laid up for me in God the Son. Since then my banker is so rich, I have no need to borrow, but live upon my notes today, and draw again tomorrow." Nettie Bartlett settled herself for the homeward trip from Philadelphia with a discontented look. She slapped Johnny when he went to get a drink, which he did the first 15 minutes of the journey, because he stepped on her toes. She jerked the baby up who was endeavoring to pick a piece of orange peel out of a pool of tobacco juice on the floor, and then settled into her discontented silence again. She was thinking about the fall sewing and the house cleaning and the endless darning and baking and cleaning, with no Aunt Hannah to fall back upon. Occasionally she reflected upon the bride's pretty dress, or had visions of Celia in her cloud-like veil looking up with happy eyes into her husband's face, and a half-jealous feeling shot through her heart. She knew how Celia felt, or thought she did. She had felt so herself, but of course all such nonsense was past. She looked gloomily across at Hiram, who was staring stolidly out of the window, with his inevitable newspaper lying across his knees. Then she curled her lip and told herself that Celia would soon have the sentiment taken out of her by the prose of everyday life. "You made a great mistake by not cultivating that minister cousin-in-law, Nettie," remarked Hiram snappily. "I talked to him every chance I got, but it takes women and compliments and that sort of thing to work on men, and especially ministers, I guess. You ought to have invited them to our house for part of their wedding trip. I'm dead certain he's rich. Did you see all that furniture he's fixed out for Celia? He'll spoil her the first thing off." "You made a great mistake yourself when you let Aunt Hannah and Celia too go away from our house, and you can't ever undo it. Yes, I saw the furniture, but his mother sent it, for Celia said so. We might have had a few blessings, and our children would have been brought up right, if Aunt Hannah had been with us. She always brings a blessing wherever she goes, and we've had nothing but ill luck since she left us." And Nettie put her handkerchief to her eyes and wept while the train sped rapidly through the darkness. Some weeks later, Celia, seated in the pleasant study of the suite of rooms which were her new home, and yet her old home, engaged in the delightful task of classifying and placing in a cabinet the various clippings which her minister husband had gathered about him during his bachelor years, came upon this poem. She paused to read it, and smiled with a little echo of the peace it spoke in her heart, and bent her head to thank the Father it was true. The child leans on the parent's breast, leaves there its cares and is at rest. The bird sits singing by his nest, and tells aloud his trust in God, and so is blessed 'neath every cloud. He has no store, he sows no seed, yet sings aloud and doth not heed. By flowing stream or grassy mead he sings to shame men who forget, in fear of need, a Father's name. The heart that trusts forever sings, and feels as light as it had wings. A well of peace within it springs. Come good or ill, whate'er today, tomorrow brings, it is His will. End of chapter 27. End of A Daily Rate by Grace Livingston Hill. Recorded by TriciaG, December 2018. Thanks for listening.